For 11 months, my granddaughter and I shared a fold-out cot in the back room of a Salvation Army shelter in Dayton, Ohio, while my son's wife hosted dinner parties in the farmhouse I'd spent 32 years paying off. She told anyone who would listen that I was unstable, that I was a drunk, that I had signed the house over willingly because I couldn't manage my own affairs anymore. Then one Tuesday morning in February, a woman in a gray wool coat knocked on the shelter door and asked the front desk for me by name. She wasn't a social worker. She wasn't a church volunteer. She was holding a manila envelope with a gold seal on it, and she said 4 words that changed everything. Your wife left instructions. My name is Russell Hale. I'm 68 years old. I spent 35 years as a machinist at a tool and die shop outside of Dayton, the kind of work that leaves your hands permanently stained with oil no matter how long you scrub them. I retired at 63 with a modest pension, a paid-off farmhouse on 4 acres in Clark County, and a granddaughter named Piper who had lived with me and my wife Dorothy since she was 4 years old, when our son Weston and his wife couldn't hold their lives together long enough to raise a child. Dorothy passed from pancreatic cancer 14 months ago. It moved fast. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, and I wasn't ready. Nobody's ever ready, but I was especially not ready because Dorothy was the one who handled the paperwork. She handled the bills, the accounts, the insurance. I handled the machines and the yard. That was our arrangement for 40 years, and it worked perfectly until the morning it didn't. 2 days after the funeral, Weston and his wife Candace showed up at the farmhouse. Not to grieve, not to check on Piper, who was 9 years old and had just lost the only grandmother she'd ever known. They showed up with a notary and a stack of documents that Candace had clearly prepared well in advance. I remember sitting at the kitchen table where Dorothy and I had eaten breakfast together every morning for decades, and Candace placed a document in front of me with a smooth, practiced calm that I have never been able to forget. She explained that Dorothy had accumulated significant medical debt, that the hospital bills and the hospice costs had exceeded our savings, that the house was the only asset large enough to cover what we owed. She told me that if I signed a quitclaim deed transferring ownership to Weston and herself, they would handle all of the debt and let me stay on the property as long as I needed. I was on 4 days without real sleep. I had just buried my wife of 41 years. Piper was upstairs crying, and I could hear her through the ceiling. I signed. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a stupid man. I've been operating precision machinery my entire career. I understand tolerances down to 1,000th of an inch, but grief does something to the brain that I cannot fully explain. It doesn't make you stupid. It makes you slow. It makes the world feel like you're watching it through glass. And when someone puts a document in front of you with an air of authority and tells you it's already settled, sometimes you sign because the weight of arguing feels heavier than anything else. Within 3 weeks, the tone changed. Candace started making comments about how the farmhouse was too large for one elderly man and a child, that it was impractical. Weston backed her up, which was the most consistent thing he had ever done in his life. By week 6, she was forwarding me listings for senior apartments in Trotwood. By week 10, she changed the alarm code without telling me, and I found out when I came back from the grocery store and couldn't get in my own front door. I called Weston. He said they were making security improvements. He said I should try to understand the situation from their perspective. I asked him what situation. He said, "Dad, the house is ours now. You knew that when you signed." I said, "Yes, but you told me I could stay." He said, "Indefinitely. Doesn't mean forever." They gave me 30 days. Piper and I packed what we could fit in the back of my 2009 Ford F-150 and left the house where I had planted every tree in the yard with my own hands. The Salvation Army shelter in Dayton was clean and the staff were kind, but it was not built for a 68-year-old man and a 9-year-old girl. We slept on a fold-out cot with a curtain for privacy. Piper had nightmares almost every night. She would wake up asking for Dorothy, and I would lie there in the dark, listening to the sounds of other people suffering, and tell her that we were going to be okay, even on the nights I didn't believe it. I had $2,300 in a checking account. My pension was $1,140 a month. A one-bedroom apartment in Dayton ran $800 to $900 easily, which left almost nothing for food, utilities, and whatever Piper needed. I had applied for 3 apartments and been turned down each time because of my age, my limited income, and the fact that I was seeking custody of a minor as a single grandparent, which apparently triggers additional requirements that I hadn't anticipated. I kept telling myself to hold on. I kept telling myself something would shift. The woman who knocked on the shelter door that February morning was named Sylvia Moorhead. She was maybe 50, sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses, the kind of person who looks like she has never in her life been uncertain about anything. She sat across from me in the shelter's small meeting room with a manila envelope on the table between us and explained that she was an attorney with a firm in Columbus. She told me her firm had been engaged by Dorothy prior to her diagnosis. I didn't understand at first. I told her Dorothy never mentioned an attorney. Sylvia said that was intentional. She told me that 2 years before she died, Dorothy had come to their firm alone. She had watched what happened to her own mother late in life. She had seen how easily elderly widows could be displaced by family members with better legal resources, and she had quietly taken steps to protect us. She used a small inheritance from her aunt, money that had come in before we were married, and had sat in a separate account for decades, money I didn't know existed. Not because Dorothy was hiding it from me, but because she said it was her emergency fund and she hoped we'd never need it. Dorothy had purchased a small commercial property in Springfield, about 20 minutes from the farmhouse. A strip of 4 rental units, 2 of them occupied by long-term tenants who paid reliably every month. She had put the property in a revocable trust. She had named me as the beneficiary. She had named Sylvia's firm as the trustee with instructions to locate me and transfer control only after 6 months had passed following her death. Dorothy had believed that if the transfer happened immediately, Candace would find a way to contest it. She wanted Candace to think she'd won first. The trust had been generating income the entire time Piper and I were sleeping on a cot. The 2 occupied units brought in $2,800 a month combined. The funds had been accumulating in the trust account for 11 months. There was $3,000 sitting in an account with my name on it. I sat in that meeting room and looked at the number on the statement Sylvia slid across the table, and I couldn't speak. Sylvia waited. She was good at waiting. Finally I said, Dorothy knew. Sylvia said she knew. I thought about every night in that shelter. I thought about Piper's nightmares and the curtain for a bedroom wall, and the mornings I'd sit in the parking lot of the shelter in my truck eating a gas station biscuit because I didn't want Piper to see how scared I was. I thought about the afternoon 3 months in when Weston called me out of the blue to say he felt terrible about how things had worked out and asked if I needed anything, and I said no because I still had enough pride left to say no, and he said good and hung up inside of 45 seconds. Dorothy had watched all of that happen from whatever place people go. She had prepared for it. She had known her son well enough to prepare for it, which broke my heart in a way that the cancer hadn't, because it meant she'd been carrying that knowledge alone for 2 years before she died. I told Sylvia I wanted to move into one of the vacant units at the property. She said that was already anticipated. The unit had been maintained empty at Dorothy's instruction. There was a note in the file that said, "When you find him, tell him I left the porch light on." Sylvia also told me something else. She told me that Weston and Candace had not, in fact, paid off Dorothy's medical debt as promised when I signed the quitclaim deed. She had pulled the records. The debt had been discharged through a hospital charity program that Dorothy had applied for before she passed, a program that Candace had known about because she had helped Dorothy fill out the application. The debt was already gone before I ever signed anything. There was nothing to cover. They had taken my house using a liability that no longer existed. There is a specific kind of anger that is very quiet. It doesn't shake you. It doesn't make you want to yell. It settles in at the base of your spine like cold concrete and just stays there, and you feel it every time you breathe. I felt that anger when Sylvia told me about the hospital debt. I felt it while I drove back to the shelter to get Piper. I felt it when I helped her pack her backpack, and she asked where we were going, and I said home. And she looked at me very carefully the way children look at you when they're not sure if you're telling the truth or protecting them from something. We moved into the unit that weekend. It was a 2-bedroom on the ground floor of a building Dorothy had clearly kept in good condition. Clean carpet, working appliances, a small backyard with a fence. Piper ran through every room twice and then came and stood next to me in the kitchen and said it smells like new. I said that's because nobody's lived here in a while. She said, does that mean we get to be the first? I said, yeah, Bug, we get to be the first. I slept in a real bed for the first time in 11 months, and I woke up at 4 a.m. because I wasn't used to it anymore. Sylvia had already initiated the legal process to examine the quitclaim deed I had signed. Ohio has specific provisions around undue influence in contract law, particularly when a signatory is in acute grief and when the inducing party has misrepresented material facts. The misrepresentation of the debt was the key. Candace had told me the debt existed and needed to be covered. The debt did not exist. That was fraud in the inducement, and Sylvia used those exact words when she walked me through what came next. I also told Sylvia about Weston, about the call, about the 45 seconds. I told her about the apartment listings Candace had forwarded while we were still living in my house. I told her about the alarm code. Sylvia wrote everything down and didn't say much. She had the contained energy of someone who was already 3 steps ahead. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday in April at the Clark County Courthouse. I wore the sport coat I had worn to Dorothy's funeral, which felt appropriate in a way I couldn't entirely explain. Piper stayed with a neighbor from the shelter, a retired schoolteacher named Frances, who had taken a liking to Piper over the months and offered to watch her for the day. Weston and Candace arrived with an attorney named Cole Branford, who had an expensive tie and the kind of practiced condescension that people in that profession sometimes develop when they've never really lost anything. He spent his opening remarks describing me as a man of diminished capacity, a grieving senior who had been confused about his own financial situation and had since attached himself to a legal theory that misrepresented a straightforward and consensual transaction. I sat at the defendant's table and listened to him describe my life as a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. I looked at Weston once during that opening. He was looking at the table. He couldn't hold it. Our attorney presented the hospital charity discharge records first, the date of discharge, the signature on the application. Candace's name in the second line of the application has the family contact who had assisted with the submission. The debt had been eliminated 11 days before I signed the quitclaim deed. Candace had known. The inducement was fraudulent. Then Sylvia called one witness, the woman who had supervised Candace's interaction with the hospital charity program, a patient advocate named Helen, who had worked at that hospital for 22 years and kept meticulous records. Helen testified that Candace had been informed in writing that the balance had been discharged. Helen had a copy of the confirmation emails she had sent to Candace's address. Branford tried to suggest that Candace may have forgotten, that in the chaos of grief and family stress, it was possible the confirmation had been overlooked. Helen said she had spoken to Candace on the phone the following day to confirm receipt. Candace had said, and Helen read this from her notes, "Thank you, that's a relief." The room got very quiet. Candace turned to say something to Branford, and he put a hand on her arm, and she stopped. The judge, a woman named Judge Patricia Overton, who had spent 20 years on the domestic and probate bench in Clark County, looked over her glasses at Candace with an expression I can only describe as the specific patience of someone who has seen exactly this before and is no longer surprised by it. Judge Overton voided the quitclaim deed. She found that the transfer had been obtained through material misrepresentation constituting fraud in the inducement. The farmhouse reverted to my ownership effective immediately. She also ordered a full accounting of any rental income or property improvements made during the period of Weston and Candace's occupancy and directed that any net gains be disgorged. Then she looked at Candace directly and said that the conduct described in the evidence presented that morning represented a troubling exploitation of a bereaved and vulnerable person, and that she was referring the matter to the Clark County Prosecutor's Office for review of potential elder fraud charges under Ohio Revised Code. Weston stood up when she said that. He said, "Your Honor, we didn't intend." Judge Overton said, "Sit down, please." He sat down. I didn't cheer. I didn't feel like cheering. I sat there and thought about Dorothy again, about the fact that she had seen this coming before the cancer did, that she had quietly built us a way out while she was still healthy enough to do it, and that she had left a note in a file in a law office in Columbus that said, "Tell him I left the porch light on." I wasn't going to cheer, but I did let myself breathe. I drove back to Springfield and picked up Piper from Francis's house. Piper asked how it went. I said, "We're going home." She said, "Which home? The new one?" I said, "No, Bug. The old one. The one with the trees." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "The one Grandma used to grow tomatoes in the backyard?" I said, "That's the one." She said, "Can we grow them again this summer?" I said, "We can grow anything you want." Moving back into the farmhouse was strange in a way I hadn't expected. Candace had rearranged things. The furniture in the living room was in different positions. There were new cabinet handles in the kitchen that Dorothy never would have chosen. The room that had been Piper's bedroom had been converted into a home office, with flat-pack furniture still showing the assembly instructions wedged behind the bookcase. I took the furniture apart piece by piece and carried it out to the garage. I repainted the room the same color it had been before. I put Piper's name back on the door in the wooden letters Dorothy had bought at a craft store years ago. Piper stood in the doorway and looked at the letters and said, "Can I put the glow stars back on the ceiling?" I said, "That's exactly what we're doing this weekend. We put the glow stars back on the ceiling. We planted tomatoes in the backyard. I got the alarm code changed to something Candace would never guess. The prosecutor's office in Clark County opened an investigation 6 weeks after the hearing. I cooperated fully. I handed over every document Sylvia had collected, every piece of correspondence, the timeline we had reconstructed showing that Candace had known the debt was discharged before she asked me to sign. I also handed over a voicemail Weston had left me the week after the quitclaim, where he said in his own voice, "All taken care of, Dad. The debt is settled. You don't have to worry about a thing." He hadn't settled anything. The debt was already gone before we signed. He was confirming a lie that had already been told. I don't know what Weston told himself about that voicemail. I don't know if he convinced himself that he was technically telling the truth, or if he just stopped thinking about it, but the prosecutor had it, and that was enough. Candace was charged with elder financial exploitation under Ohio law. The charge carries up to 18 months and significant fines. Weston was charged as a co-conspirator. They retained Branford again, and Branford clearly told them to avoid trial, because they both entered plea agreements 4 months later. Candace received 12 months of supervised probation, a $15,000 fine, and a civil restitution order covering the rent she had collected from the farmhouse during the period of occupation. Weston received probation and a smaller fine. He also lost his real estate license, because apparently you cannot hold a real estate license in Ohio while under a fraud conviction, and Weston had gotten his license 2 years earlier when Candace decided that flipping houses was going to be their path to financial independence. I found that part almost funny. Almost. I heard about the sentencing from Sylvia over the phone. I was in the backyard at the time, turning the soil in the garden bed while Piper sat on the back steps drawing in a sketchbook Francis had given her. I said thank you to Sylvia, and I stood there for a moment with the phone in my hand looking at the yard Dorothy and I had built over 32 years. There's an oak tree at the back corner that I planted from a sapling when Weston was 7 years old. It's probably 40 feet tall now. Dorothy used to say that tree was the one thing on the property that was genuinely none of our doing, that we just put it in the ground and it decided the rest. She was right. That's how it goes with the things that last. Piper looked up from her sketchbook and asked if everything was okay. I said yes. She went back to drawing. I went back to turning the soil. I want to say something about Dorothy because this story belongs to her more than it belongs to me. She was not a dramatic woman. She didn't make grand gestures or speeches. When she set something in motion, she did it quietly, and then she didn't talk about it, because in her view, the point of doing a thing was the doing, not the telling. She had watched my father's second wife contest his will and drag the family through 3 years of litigation. She had watched her own mother's savings disappear into a long-term care situation that the family had mismanaged. She had paid attention over decades to the ways that love and money get tangled up with inheritance and grief, and she had drawn her own conclusions. She never told me about the Springfield property because she was afraid I would feel emasculated by it. She said in a letter Sylvia gave me that had been kept in the file alongside the trust documents. She said she knew I had too much pride to sit comfortably with the idea of a safety net she had built without me. She said she hoped I would never need it. She said if I was reading this letter, she was sorry it had come to this, but she needed me to know that she had loved me every day, including every day she didn't tell me this particular thing. I have read that letter more times than I can count. I keep it in the drawer of my nightstand. I am not someone who talks easily about what I feel. I spent 35 years in a machine shop where the loudest sounds were metal on metal, and nobody asked you how you were doing unless something was visibly wrong. But I will say this. The thing that almost broke me during those 11 months wasn't the shelter or the money, or even watching Piper try to adapt to something no 9-year-old should have to adapt to. The thing that almost broke me was the belief that I had failed Dorothy, that she had trusted me to hold things together and I had let someone take it all apart in an afternoon. That the house she had loved and the life we had built together had been taken by a stack of papers I signed without understanding. It turned out I hadn't failed her. She had already caught the fall before it happened. She had just done it the way she did everything, quietly, practically, without fanfare, and then left a note in a drawer somewhere telling me where to look. I think about that when things get difficult. I think about the porch light she left on. Piper's 10 now. She's in 4th grade at the same elementary school she attended before we lost the house, and her teacher says she is one of the strongest readers in the class. She still draws in the sketchbook Francis gave her, and the drawings have gotten more detailed, more confident. She draws the oak tree in the backyard a lot. She draws it in different seasons, different lights. She says she wants to see what it looks like in every kind of weather. I told her that was a good project. I told her a tree like that has a lot of looks, and she's got time to catch them all. This past spring we planted the tomatoes again, more than last year. Piper picked the varieties herself from a seed catalog she'd found in the kitchen drawer, the same catalog Dorothy used to order from. She chose 3 kinds I'd never grown before and 2 that Dorothy planted every single year without exception. I didn't tell her which ones Dorothy always picked. She just found them in the catalog and pointed and said, "These ones look good." Some things move forward on their own. I don't know what to say about Weston. I've gone back and forth on it more times than I can count. He's my son. He came from me and from Dorothy, and whatever happened to turn him into the person who stood in my kitchen with a notary and helped take my house while I was still in the first week of mourning, I don't fully understand it. I don't know if he told himself it was practical. I don't know if Candace convinced him and he went along because going along was always easier for him than pushing back. I don't know if he thought I wouldn't fight or couldn't fight, or if he just stopped thinking about it at a certain point and let the momentum carry him. He hasn't called since the sentencing. I haven't called him. There's a version of this where that changes someday. There's a version where it doesn't. I've made a kind of peace with not knowing which version is coming. What I know is this. I'm 68 years old. I live in the house I paid off. The garden is producing better than it has in years, and there's a kid at the kitchen table every morning who wants to know what she should draw next. That's not a small thing. That's not nothing. That's, in fact, most of what matters. Dorothy knew what she was doing when she left us that property in Springfield. We still own it. The 2 long-term tenants are still there, still paying on time. The 2 vacant units are rented now as well. I manage the property myself. I repaired a section of fascia on the back unit 2 weekends ago, and it took me 4 hours and felt like the most useful thing I'd done in months. I kept the porch light on. I think that's what she would have wanted. I still think about the moment I signed that quitclaim deed. 4 days without sleep, Piper crying upstairs, Candace sliding a document across Dorothy's kitchen table like it was routine. I have turned that moment over in my mind more times than I can count, and what I keep coming back to is not the anger, it's the recognition. I made it easy for them. Not because I was foolish, but because I had confused exhaustion with surrender and called it trust. There's a cause to every effect, even the ones that feel random. Candace didn't walk into that kitchen on a guess. She had prepared. She had timed it. She understood that grief narrows a person's field of vision, and she used that narrowing deliberately. What happened to me wasn't bad luck. It was a predictable result of someone with no moral center finding a person at their lowest and calculating exactly how far they could push. That's not fate. That's a choice another human being made, And choices like that carry weight that eventually lands somewhere. It landed in a courtroom in Clark County. It landed in the form of a patient advocate named Helen who kept meticulous records and told the truth without hesitation. It landed in the form of a voicemail Weston had left without thinking, confirming a lie in his own voice. The people who exploit the grieving tend to believe that chaos protects them, that the confusion of loss will bury the evidence. What they don't account for is someone like Dorothy, who was clear-eyed and careful even while she was dying, who thought 3 steps ahead not out of suspicion, but out of love. Dorothy's intelligence saved us. Not cleverness, not cunning, genuine, patient, forward-thinking intelligence that understood how systems work and how people behave under pressure. She didn't panic. She didn't make dramatic gestures. She found an attorney, set up a trust, maintained a property, and left a note that said, "Tell him I left the porch light on." That kind of thinking doesn't come from anger or fear. It comes from someone who has spent a lifetime paying attention and refuses to stop even when time is running short. What I had to bring to it was something harder for me to come by. I had to keep going through 11 months in the shelter without becoming someone I didn't recognize. I had to protect Piper's sense of safety while I had almost none of my own. I had to resist the version of this story where I went quiet and stayed quiet, where I accepted that this was just how things ended up for people like me. That resistance, the daily unglamorous decision to not quit, is the only thing I can actually take credit for. Dorothy built the floor. I just refused to fall through it. I think the hardest thing about being wronged by family is that it changes how you understand the past. You go back through years of shared meals and holidays, and you start to see things differently. But I've learned that dwelling in that reinterpretation is its own trap. What matters more is what you do with the present. Piper is drawing the oak tree in every season. The tomatoes are coming in. The tenants in Springfield pay on time. I repaired the fascia on the back unit with my own hands, and it will hold for 20 years. That's the life Dorothy built us, the chance to live. The least I can do is live it right.